In a move as corrupt as it was predictable, Judge Cannon has just dismissed Donald Trump's case in Florida for the theft and illegal retention of classified documents on the grounds that the appointment of a special counsel was unconstitutional. Now, to be clear, special counsels in this country have been used since the 1800s. The first one dates back to 1875, when President Ulysses S. Grant appointed a special counsel to investigate the whiskey ring tax revenue scandal, which resulted in 238 indictments and 110 convictions. Meaning that Judge Cannon, who I should remind you is a Trump appointee, just overturned well over a century of precedent, all in blind deference to Donald Trump. And why'd she do it? Well, she had help from Clarence Thomas at the U.S. Supreme Court. Because in the immunity ruling, Clarence Thomas did something unprecedented. He issued an advisory opinion offering up that the appointment of special counsels may be unconstitutional. Quote, if there is no law establishing the office that the special counsel occupies, then he cannot proceed with his prosecution. A private citizen cannot criminally prosecute anyone, let alone a former president. And I say this was unprecedented because this was not the issue being litigated at the U.S. Supreme Court. Thomas wrote this advisory opinion solely as a little Easter egg for Judge Cannon, knowing that the issue she was investigating at that exact moment was a motion by Trump's team to dismiss the charges based on, you guessed it, this notion that the appointment of a special counsel, Jack Smith, wasn't constitutional. In other words, Clarence Thomas saw that there was an opening with that motion, and from an unrelated opinion on a presidential immunity case, basically sent a message to Judge Cannon letting her know that if the case is dismissed, that at least he would be a receptive audience if and when that dismissal gets challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, there is some silver lining here, and it is a testament to just how broken our court system is. At a bare minimum, this case will now be out of Judge Cannon's courtroom, where it was always going nowhere, and it can move through the appeals process. Now, the 11th Circuit will have the opportunity to rule on this case, and you'll remember that the 11th Circuit already overturned Judge Cannon's ruling once, when they found that she interfered on Trump's behalf early in the pretrial process. And regardless of how the 11th Circuit rules, it will then be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I understand that going to the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't exactly inspire confidence, because this is the same Supreme Court on which Clarence Thomas sits, and we already know how he'll rule on this issue. But there are still 8 other justices, and this issue is so clear-cut that special counsels have been used for over 100 years that perhaps they'll find a modicum of integrity and rule correctly, but that possibility is still more than we could have ever gotten from Aileen Cannon. Here's my Legal Breakdown co-host digging into the details of exactly that point. Would it be better for Judge Cannon now to just dismiss the case in deference to Trump and just get this thing out of the courtroom, knowing that the 11th Circuit may overturn it and that it could eventually get to the Supreme Court, where maybe they'll have some shred of integrity and allow it to stand on its face, because again, the illegal retention of classified documents was an act that Donald Trump committed as a private citizen, but at least it can get us moving, and we wouldn't just be stuck in this interminable waiting period for Judge Cannon to just do something. So at least we would get some movement and just get off of this stop train, to use your earlier analogy, that we're stuck on right now.
Yeah, so interminable delays, I think, is a great way to put it, because if this thing continues to be litigated to death endlessly, as Judge Cannon seems inclined to let happen, who knows when we could get any resolution of the question whether a former president of the United States stole some of our most closely guarded, classified and national defense secrets, and then goodness knows how he may have exploited them to his advantage and endangered our national security. But, here's kind of my bottom line in response to your question. What Judge Cannon now knows is she has at least one receptive justice on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, who I feel compelled to add, Brian, he did something that no judge or justice is permitted to do. He rendered what we call an advisory opinion. In 1911, the Supreme Court said, we don't render advisory opinions. We don't offer advice or possible resolutions of things that are not before us, questions that haven't been briefed or argued. But that's what Clarence Thomas did, and it's dirty, and it's unethical, and it feels nefarious to me. But he basically gave permission to Judge Cannon, saying, why don't you go ahead and dismiss the case? Why don't you find that Jack Smith was not lawfully appointed special counsel, because I've got your back when the case makes it up to the Supreme Court. Now, mind you, every other judge, every other court that has had to deal with this issue of whether special counsel or independent counsel are lawful and are properly used under our constitutional construct, including the Supreme Court, have ruled, yes, it's proper. But, Judge Cannon, perhaps listening to Justice Thomas, may take a flyer on ruling otherwise and dismissing the case.
Well, let me ask the question this way. Where do you think we would have better luck to see some accountability handed down? Would it be with Judge Cannon, or would it be to just have her dismiss this case, get it through the 11th Circuit, doesn't really matter what they rule because it's going to be appealed up to the Supreme Court anyway, and then allow the Supreme Court to rule on this question? Where do you think that we'll have a better chance of some accountability actually being handed down?
Well, I've lost all confidence in Judge Cannon's impartiality and her ethics. So I think anything that results in Judge Cannon being out of the mix is a good thing in the long term. Of course, if the case ends up back in the Supreme Court, which just sort of bestowed this obscene level of presidential immunity on Donald Trump, I'm not optimistic that they will get this right. However, I think all things considered, I would rather Judge Cannon just dismiss the case on some pretense and let's get this thing working through the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which may very well get it right. I would expect them to get it right. They got the last Trump litigation right when they reversed Judge Cannon and said she abused her discretion in favor of Donald Trump. They'll get it right, and that may put some pressure on the Supreme Court to perhaps consider getting it right.
I should note, too, that this all could have been avoided had Merrick Garland simply had a sitting U.S. attorney prosecute Donald Trump rather than appointing a special counsel. And yet, because he was so concerned about the optics of politicization, he decided to appoint Jack Smith instead. And this is not necessarily to blame Merrick Garland in one sense, because special counsels have, again, been used forever to prosecute cases, but had he simply allowed a U.S. attorney to do their jobs and prosecute this case instead of being so worried about how things might look, we wouldn't be in this mess. And so now, in Merrick Garland's interminable efforts to make this seem fair, Republicans have rolled him yet again, which doesn't exactly seem fair to me. We are now in a position where things certainly have been politicized, and yet not in Biden's favor, but in Trump's. All because of the appointment of a special counsel that didn't even need to happen had Merrick Garland simply done his job and appointed a normal prosecutor to investigate a criminal. But instead, per usual, he bent over backwards because, God forbid, things seem politicized. If you want to see the asymmetry on display between the two parties, it is Democrats like Merrick Garland twisting themselves into pretzels to seem fair, and Republicans like Aileen Cannon and Clarence Thomas and Donald Trump who see that weakness and so easily exploit it. If only Merrick Garland had enough of a memory to remember that his own appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court was thwarted by Republicans who didn't care for a second about optics and instead just sought power. That same dynamic is at play here, and it continues to humiliate him at every turn. And yet still, he will wield no power because it doesn't seem that the rule of law will ever supersede the significance of those ever-important optics. So look, the bad news is that another Trump lackey has very clearly allowed her corruption to benefit Trump, who somehow had every single moment over the last few months break in his favor. And these acolytes will continue to help him at every turn because they have no scruples and want nothing more than proximity to power. But the good news is that this case is now out of Judge Cannon's hands, and we finally have the possibility for other judges to take a stab at what should be an open and shut case. But remember this, despite any rulings, one thing remains clear. It is not now nor ever up to the courts to save us. It's not up to prosecutors or judges or attorneys. The only thing that will protect us from another Trump term is us showing up in November and voting. That was always true, and it remains true now. So I understand that the emotion right now might be despair, but nothing changes from our perspective. All this does is highlight the overt criminality on the right. So let it fuel you, let it inspire you to turn out, to bring your friends and family and neighbors and coworkers to turn out, and to do your part to ensure that the leader of this criminal enterprise, which yes, does include judges, never gets near the levers of power again. I've got a really exciting announcement. I've written a book. It's called Shameless. This book explores how Republicans have exploited their historical branding while attacking our democracy, how the media has proven itself a willful participant, and how Democrats can learn from this to rebalance the political scales and save our democracy. It has been a lifelong dream of mine to write my own book, and so I'd like to ask you to pre-order it by clicking the link right here on the screen. And if you buy within this pre-order period, your book is going to come with a signed nameplate. As you know, I've never had a single sponsor on my channel. I don't ask for money or anything like that, but if you're looking for a way to support me, this is hands down the best way to do it. So again, follow the link right here on the screen, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for pre-ordering Shameless. And as always, make sure to subscribe to see more of my content.